Now, the purpose of the Bible is to testify of Jesus Christ. The Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, points to Christ.
The Bible is true in a very strange way. What you do as an educated person is sample that structure that constitutes the sum total of the texts of our civilization.
Because if those four things are true, that there's truth, that God exists, that miracles are possible, and the New Testament is reliable enough to let us know that the resurrection occurred, then Christianity is true. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity is true.
So, what is the food you give to the soul? It is reading the Bible, the Word of God. And I don't care who you are, you cannot live a victorious life if you neglect Bible reading and Bible study.
But what we have at stake here is far more than that. You know, your life depends on this book. So read it.
Numbers chapter 10. The Pulpit Commentary, verse 1. And the Lord spake. The command to make the silver trumpets is introduced here, because one principal use of them was connected with the order of march. It does not necessarily follow that the command was actually given exactly at this time, or that all the different directions for use formed part of one communication. They may have been gathered together for convenience sake. See the introduction on this subject. It is, however, a mistake to suppose that this use of trumpets has been anticipated in Leviticus chapter 20, 5 verse 9, or elsewhere, for the trumpets there mentioned were altogether different in shape, as in material. Verse 2, make thee 2 trumpets. Hebrew, katsatsera. From the testimony of Josephus, from the representation on the arch of Titus, and from a comparison of ancient Egyptian trumpets, it is clear that these trumpets were straight, long, and narrow, with an expanded mouth. The shofar, or trumpet of the Jubilee, on the other hand, was a buccina, or cornet, either made of a ram's horn, or shaped like one of a whole piece, rather, of beaten work. Hebrew, mikshah, see on Exodus, chapter 20, 5 verse 18. Septuagint, fe. Probably they were made of a single plate of silver beaten out into the required shape, which was very simple. Verse 3, when they shall blow with them. With both of them. All the assembly, by their natural or customary representatives. Verse 5, when ye blow an alarm. Hebrew, fe. This seems to signify a continuous peal, easily distinguished, wherever audible, from the blowing in short, sharp tones. Hebrew, fe mentioned below. Verse 7, the peal of alarm was to be blown. Fe, for their breaking up, for that purpose, and no other. The camps, only those on the east Judah with Issachar and Zebulun, and on the south Reuben with Simeon and Gad are here mentioned. It may be that the silver trumpets themselves were carried with the sacred utensils after the southern camps, and that some other means were employed to start the remaining tribes. Or it may be that the omission is due to some accidental circumstance. The Septuagint inserts in verse 6, and ye shall sound a third alarm. And the camps which are pitched westwards shall move. And ye shall sound a fourth alarm, and the camps which are pitched northwards shall move. No doubt this was the actual order of starting. However, the signal was given. Verse 8. The sons of Aaron, the priests, shall blow. It was natural that they should be made responsible for the custody and use of these trumpets, not because their sound represented the voice of God, but because they were used for religious purposes, and could only be safely kept in the sanctuary. An ordinance forever. The accustomed formula for some sacred institution, which was to have a permanent character and an eternal meaning. Compare Exodus, chapter 12, verse 24. The truth of these words cannot be exhausted by an actual use of 1,500 years, followed by complete disuse for 1,800 years. The ordinance of the silver trumpets must be perpetuated forever in the gospel, or else the divine word has failed. Verse 9. If ye go to war, fe, come into war, or be engaged, denoting actual hostilities in your land. The practical use of the trumpets ceased with the years of wandering. The ceremonial use was continued as long as the people dwelt in their land. The spiritual use remains an ordinance forever, as long as the church is militant here on earth. that the use of the 2 silver trumpets was ceremonial, and not practical, after the conquest of Canaan is evident from the purpose and effect ascribed to that use, whether in war or in worship. That purpose was not to convoke the people, nor to give signals to the host, but to put God in mind of his promises, and to invoke his covenanted grace. Indeed, 2 trumpets, as here prescribed, could not be otherwise than ceremonially used after the nation was spread abroad over the whole face of Canaan, and there is no direction to make more than 2 such trumpets. The use of trumpets in subsequent times is indeed often mentioned both in war and in holy festivities, and it was undoubtedly founded upon this divine ordinance. But it was not in literal compliance with it, for the obvious reason that many trumpets were used instead of 2 only. See 1 Chronicles, chapter 15, verse 20. 4. 2 Chronicles, chapter 5, verse 12. Nehemiah, chapter 12, verse 30. 5. In these passages, and probably in 2 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 12, we have abundant evidence of one of those expansions and adaptations of the Mosaic ritual which were so freely made under the house of David, chapter 30, 1 verse 6, and perhaps 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 6, and Psalm chapter 81, verse 3, may be quoted as pointing to the strict fulfillment of the law as it stands. Verse 10. In the day of your gladness, any day of national thanksgiving, celebrated with religious services, as the feast of the dedication, John chapter 10 verse 22, or of Purim, Esther chapter 9 verse 19, and the following ones. In your solemn days, the feasts appointed to be observed by the law, see chapters 28 and 29. In the beginnings of your months, new moon days, Psalm, chapter 81 verse 3. Only the first day of the 7th month was properly a feast, Leviticus chapter 20. 3 verse 20, but all were distinguished by special sacrifices, chapter 28 verse 11. Chapter 10 verses 11 through 20. 8. The order of march from Sinai verse 11. On the 20th day of the 2nd month. This answered approximately to our May 6th, when the spring verdure would still be on the land, but the heat of the day would already have become intense. We may well suppose that the departure would have taken place a month earlier, had it not been necessary to wait for the due celebration of the 2nd, or supplemental Passover, Numbers chapter 9 verse 11. As this march was, next to the actual Exodus, the great trial of Israel's faith and obedience, it was most important that none should commence it otherwise than in full communion with their God and with one another. The cloud was taken up, for the first time since the tabernacle had been reared up, Exodus chapter 40 verse 34, this being the divine signal for departure. The silver trumpets would immediately announce the fact to all the hosts. Verse 12, took their journeys, literally, marched according to their journeys, Septuagint, set forward with their baggage, and the cloud rested in the wilderness of Paran. Taken by itself, this would seem to apply to the first resting of the cloud, and the first halt of the host after breaking up from the wilderness of Sinai. It appears, however, from Numbers chapter 12 verse 16, that the wilderness of Paran was fully reached after leaving Hazeroth at the end of 3 days' journey from Sinai. Nor would a shorter space of time suffice to carry the host across the mountain barrier of the Jebel et Tai, which forms the clearly marked southern limit of the desert plateau of Paran Sea. Next note. Some critics have arbitrarily extended the limits of the wilderness of Paran so as to include the sandy waste between Sinai and the Jebel et Tai, and therefore the very first halting place of Israel. This, however, is unnecessary as well as arbitrary, for 1 verses 12-13 are evidently in the nature of a summary, and the same subject is confessedly taken up again in verse 33 and the following, and 2. The departure from Sinai is expressly said to have been for a 3 days' journey, verse 33, which must mean that the march, although actually divided into 3 stages, was regarded as a single journey, because it brought them to their immediate destination in the wilderness of Paran. Here then is a plain reason for the statement in this verse. The cloud did indeed rest twice between the 2 wildernesses, but only so as to allow of a night's repose, not so as to break the continuity of the march. The wilderness of Paran. Septuagint. This geographical expression is nowhere exactly defined in Holy Scripture. And the name itself has disappeared, for in spite of the resemblance in sound, a resemblance here, as in so many cases, wholly delusive, it seems to have no connection whatever with the Wadi Faran, the fertile valley at the base of Serbal, or with the town which once shared the name. All the allusions, however, in the Old Testament to Paran point to a district so clearly marked out, so deeply stamped with its own characteristics by nature, that no mistake is possible. This district is now called Ethie, the wandering, and is still remembered in the traditions of the Arabs as the scene of the wanderings of the people of God, little known and never thoroughly explored. Its main features are nevertheless unmistakable, and its boundaries sharply defined, measuring about 150 miles in either direction. Its southern frontier, now called the Jebel Ethie, is divided by the broad sandy waste Ramley from the Sinaitic Mountains, and the Sinaitic Peninsula, properly so called. Its northern mountain mass looks across the deep fissure of the Wadi Marais, or Desert of Zin, some 10 or 15 miles broad, into Arakshma, the mountain of the Amorite, the southern extension of the plateau of Judah. On the east, it fails abruptly down to the narrow beach of the Elenite Gulf, and to the Arabah. On the west alone it sinks slowly into the sandy desert of Shur, which separates it from the Mediterranean and from Egypt. Ethie is itself divided into nearly equal halves by the Wadi el Arish, or River of Egypt, which, rising on the northern slopes of the Jebel Ethie, and running northwards through the whole plateau, turns off to the west, and is lost in the desert of Shur. That the western half of the plateau went also under the name of Paran is evident from the history of Ishmael. See especially Genesis chapter 21 verse 21. Genesis chapter 25 verse 18. But it was through the eastern portion alone that the wanderings of the Israelites, so far as we can trace them, lay. This wilderness of Paran is indeed a great and terrible wilderness, Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 9, lacking for the most part the precipitous grandeur of the granite mountains of Sinai, but lacking also their fertile valleys and numerous streams. A bare limestone or sandstone plateau, crossed by low ranges of hills seamed with innumerable dry water courses and interspersed with large patches of sand and gravel, is what now meets the eye of the traveler in this forsaken land. It is true that a good deal of rain falls at times, and that when it does fall vegetation appears with surprising rapidity and abundance. It is true also that the district has been persistently denuded of trees and shrubs for the sake of fuel. But whatever mitigations may have then existed, it is clear from the Bible itself that the country was then, as now, emphatically frightful. Compare Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 19. Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 15. Deuteronomy chapter 30, 2 verse 10. Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 6. Something may be set, no doubt, to the account of rhetoric, and much may be allowed for variety of seasons. Even in Australia, the very same district will appear at one time like the desolation of 1,000 years, and in the very next year it will blossom as the rose. But at certain seasons, at any rate, Ethie was, as it is, a howling wilderness, where the dreadful silence of a lifeless land was only broken by the nightly howling of unclean beasts who tracked the footsteps of the living in order to devour the carcasses of the dead. Perhaps so bad a country has never been attempted by any army in modern days, even by the Russian troops in Central Asia. Amongst the many wadis which drain the uncertain rain-fall of the eastern half of Ethie, and at the same time testify to a greater rain-fall in bygone ages, the most important is the Wadi el Tarafa, which, also rising on the northern slopes of Jebel Ethie, runs northwards, and north-westwards, and finally opens into the Arabah. Towards its northern limit, Ethie changes its character for the worse. Here it rises into a precipitous quadrilateral of mountains, about 40 miles square, not very lofty, but exceedingly steep and rugged, composed in great measure of dazzling masses of bare chalk, or limestone, which glow as in a furnace beneath the summer sun. This mountain mass, now called the Azimat, or mountain country of the Azazime, rising steeply from the rest of the plateau to the southward, is almost completely detached by deep depressions from the surrounding districts. At the northwest corner alone it is united by a short range of mountains with Arachma, and so with the highlands of southern Palestine. From this corner, the weighty Murray descends broad and deep towards the Cast, forking at the eastern extremity towards the Arabah on the southeast, and towards the Dead Sea on the north-east. The interior of this inaccessible country has yet to be really explored, and it is the scanty nature of our present knowledge concerning it which, more than anything else, prevents us from following with any certainty the march of the Israelites as recorded in this book. Verse 13. And they first took their journey. The meaning of this is somewhat doubtful. The Septuagint has Fefe, the foremost set out. The Vulgate, Perfecti sunt per termis suas, perhaps it means, they journeyed in the order of precedence assigned to them by their marching orders in chapter 2. Verse 14. According to their armies. In each camp, and under each of the 4 standards, there were 3 tribal hosts, each an army in itself. Verse 17. And the tabernacle was taken down. That is, the fabric of it, the boards, curtains, and other heavy portions which were packed upon the 6 wagons provided for the purpose. Numbers, chapter 7, verses 5 through 9. And the sons of Gershon and the sons of Merari set forward, between the 1st and 2nd divisions of the host. In chapter 2 it had been directed in general terms that the tabernacle should set forward with the camp of the Levites in the midst of the host between the 2nd and 3rd divisions. At that time the duties of the several Levitical families had not been specified, and the orders for the taking down and transport of the tabernacle and its furniture had not been given in detail. It would be historically an error, and theologically a superstition, to imagine that divine commands such as these had no elasticity, and left no room for adaptation. Under the teaching of experience, or for the sake of obvious convenience, whether the present modification was directly commanded by God himself, or whether it was made on the authority of Moses, does not here appear. There can be no question that subsequent theocratic rulers of Israel claimed and used a large liberty in modifying the divinely originated ritual and order. Compare the case of the Passover, the arrangements of Solomon's temple as corresponding with those of the tabernacle, and even the use of the silver trumpets. The Septuagint has the future tense here, fe kappa, tau, lambda, as if to mark it as a fresh command. Verse 21. The sanctuary. Rather, the holy things. Fe, equivalent to the fe if Numbers, chapter 4, verse 4. Septuagint, fe. The sacred furniture mentioned in chapter Numbers, chapter 3 verse 30, 1, but, compare verse 30, 3. The other did set up the tabernacle. Literally, they set up, but no doubt it means the Gershonites and Merarites, whose business it was. Verse 25. The reward of all the camps. Literally, the collector, or the gatherer. Of all the camps, the word is applied by Isaiah to God himself. Isaiah chapter 50, 2 verse 12. Isaiah chapter 50. 8 verse 8, as to him that gathereth the outcasts of Israel. Dan may have been the collector of all the camps simply in the sense that his host closed in all the others from behind, and in pitching completed the full number. Under any ordinary circumstances, however, see next note the work of the rear guard in collecting stragglers, and in taking charge of such as had fainted by the way must have been arduous, and important in the extreme. Verse 28. Thus were the journeyings. Rather, these were the journeyings, the marchings of the various hosts of which the nation was composed. The question may here be asked, which is considered more at large in the introduction, how it was possible for a nation of more than 2 million souls, containing the usual proportion of aged people, women, and children, to march as here represented, in compact columns closely following one another, without straggling, without confusion, without incalculable suffering and loss of life. That the line of march was intended to be compact and unbroken is plain, amongst other things, from the directions given about the tabernacle. The fabric was sent on in advance with the evident intent that it should be reared up and ready to receive the holy things by the time they arrived. Yet between the fabric and the furniture there marched more than 500,000 of people. That camp of Reuben, all of whom had to reach the camping ground and turn off to the right before the Kohathites could rejoin their brethren. Now discipline and drill will do wonders in the way of ordering and expediting the movements even of vast multitudes. If they are thoroughly under control, the family organization also of the tribes, and the long leisure which they had enjoyed at Sinai, gave every opportunity of perfecting the necessary discipline. But it is clear that no discipline could make such an arrangement as the one above mentioned feasible under the ordinary circumstances of human life. It would be absolutely necessary to eliminate all the casualties, and all the sicknesses which would naturally clog and hinder the march of such a multitude, in order that it might be compressed within the required limits of time and space. Have we any ground for supposing that these casualties and sicknesses were eliminated? In answering this question, we must clearly distinguish between the journey from Sinai to Kadesh, on the borders of Palestine, which was a journey of only 11 days, Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 2, and the subsequent wanderings of the people of Israel. It is the 11 days' journey only with which we are concerned, because it was for this journey only that provision was made, and orders were given by the God of Israel. During the subsequent years of wandering and of excommunication, there can be no doubt that the marching orders fell into abeyance as entirely as the sacrificial system and the rite of circumcision itself. During these years, the various camps may have scattered themselves abroad, marched, and halted very much as the circumstances of the day demanded. But that this was not and could not be the case during the short journey which should have landed them in Canaan is obvious from the whole tone, as well as from the particular details, of the commandments considered above. It is further to be borne in mind that the divine promise and undertaking at the Exodus was impliedly, if not explicitly, to bring the whole people, one and all, small and great, safely to their promised home. When the psalmist asserts, Psalm chapter 105 verse 37, that there was not one feeble person among their tribes, he does not go beyond what is plainly intimated in the narrative. If of their cattle not an hoof must be left behind, lest the absolute character of the deliverance be marred, how much more necessary was it that not a soul be abandoned to Egyptian vengeance? And how could all depart unless all were providentially saved from sickness and infirmity? But the same necessity, the necessity of his own goodness, held good when the Exodus was accomplished. God could not bring any individual in Israel out of Egypt only to perish in the wilderness, unless it were through his own default. He who had brought them out with so lavish a display of miraculous power was, we may say with reverence, is bound also to bring them in. Else they had been actual losers by obedience, and his word had not been kept to them, under a covenant and a dispensation, which assuredly did not look one hand's breadth beyond the present life. It must have seemed to be of the essence of the promise which they believed that not one of them should die or have to be left behind, and as the death or loss of one of God's people would have vitiated the temporal promise to Thegnin, so also it would have vitiated the eternal promise to us. For they were ensamples of us, and confessedly what was done for them was done at least as much for our sakes as for theirs. Now the promise of God is manifest unto every one that is included within his new covenant, namely to say, to bring him safely at last unto the heavenly Canaan, and that in spite of every danger, if only he do not draw back. The whole analogy, therefore, and the typical meaning of the Exodus would be overthrown if any single Israelite who had crossed the Red Sea failed to enter into rest, save as the consequence of his own sin. We conclude, therefore, with some confidence that the ordinary incidents of mortality were providentially excluded from the present march, as from the previous interval, that none fell sick, none became helpless, none died a natural death. We know that the great difficulty of a sufficient supply of food was miraculously met. We know that in numberless respects the passage from Egypt to Canaan was hedged about with supernatural aids. Is there any difficulty in supposing that he who gave them bread to eat and water to drink, who led them by a cloudy and a fiery pillar, could also give them health and strength to walk, and not be weary? Is it unreasonable to imagine that he who spake in his tender pity of the flight from Judea to Pella, woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, miraculously restrained for that season the natural increase of his people? The invitation to Hobab, verses 29 through 32. Verse 20. 9. Hobab, the Sioux of Regel, or rather Reel, of which Regel is simply the Septuagint. and Vulgate variation, Moses' father-in-law. It is not quite certain who this Hobab was. The name occurs only here and in Judges, chapter 4 verse 11. The older opinion followed by the authorized version identified Hobab with Jethro, and Jethro with Royal, the priest of Midian, and father of Zipporah, Moses' wife. It is of course no real objection to this opinion that Hobab is here called the son of Royal. For the name may quite well have been an hereditary one, like Abimelech, and so many others. Nor need the multiplicity of names given to one individual astonish us, for it is a frequent occurrence in the Old Testament and not infrequent in the New. The father-in-law of Moses was a priest, holding probably by right of birth the patriarchal dignity of tribal priest, as Job did on a smaller, and Melchizedek on a larger scale. He may very well, therefore, have had one or more official names in addition to his personal name. If this is accepted, then it may serve as one instance amongst many to remind us how extremely careless the inspired writers are about names. Careless not in the sense of not caring whether they are right or wrong, but in the sense of not betraying, and not feeling the least anxiety to avoid the appearance and suspicion of inaccuracy. Even in the lists of the 12 apostles we are forced to believe that Judas, the brother of James, is the same person as Lebbaeus and Thaddeus, and it is a matter of endless discussion whether or no Bartholomew was the same as Nathanael. On the face of it, Scripture proclaims that it uses no arts, that it takes no pains to preserve an appearance of accuracy, that appearance which is so easily simulated for the purposes of falsehood. Holy Scripture may therefore fairly claim to be read without that captiousness, without that demand for minute carefulness, and obvious consistency, which we rightly apply to one of our own histories. The modern historian avowedly tells his story as a witness does in the presence of a hostile council. The sacred historian tells his as a man does to the children round his knee. Surely such an obvious fact should disarm a good deal of the petty criticism which carps at the sacred narrative. Many, however, will think that the balance of probability is against the older opinion. It is certain that the word translated father-in-law has no such definiteness either in the Hebrew or in the Septuagint. It means simply a marriage relation, and is even used by Zipporah of Moses himself, Exodus, chapter 4 verses 25, 26, Hebrew. The Septuagint avoids the word. It is just as likely to mean brother-in-law when applied to Hobab, as Moses was already 80 years old when Jethro is first mentioned. Exodus chapter 3 verse 1. It may seem probable that his father-in-law was by that time dead, and succeeded in his priestly office by his eldest son. In that case, Hobab would be a younger son of Reuel, and as such free to leave the home of his ancestors and to join himself to his sister's people. Verse 31. Forasmuch as thou knowest how we are to encamp in the wilderness, and thou mayest be to us instead of eyes. It is an obvious conclusion, from the reasons here urged by Moses, that the many and wonderful promises of divine guidance and divine direction did not supersede in his eyes the use of all available human aids. It is not indeed easy to say where any room was left for the good offices and experience of Hobab. The cloud of the divine presence seemed to control absolutely the journeying and encamping of the people. Yet if we really knew in detail the actual ordering of that wondrous march, we should doubtless find that the heavenly guidance did but give unity and certainty to all the wisdom, caution, and endeavor of its earthly leaders. Indeed, if we recall to mind that the host is calculated at more than 2 millions of people, it is quite evident that even during the march to Kadesh and much more in the long wanderings which followed, it must have been extremely difficult to keep the various divisions together in the broken and difficult country which they were to traverse, which had been familiar to Hobab from his youth. There would be scope enough for all his ability as a guide, and it would seem that it was just this prospect of being really useful to the people of Israel that prevailed with Hobab. He must indeed have felt assured that a wonderful future awaited a nation whose past and present were, even within his own knowledge, so wonderful. But that alone could not move him to leave his own land and his own kindred, a firing so unspeakably repugnant to the feelings and traditions of his age and country. Doubtless to the child of the desert, whose life was a never-ending struggle with the dangers and vicissitudes of the wilderness, the land of promise, flowing with milk and honey, watered with the rain of heaven, seemed like the Garden of Eden. Yet the offer of an heritage within that land moved him not so much. It would appear as the claim upon his own good offices in helping the chosen people to reach their own abode. The Septuagint translation, or rather paraphrase, of this verse is, "Leave us not, forasmuch as thou wast with us in the wilderness, and thou shalt be an elder among us." This seems, on the one hand, to identify Hobab with Jethro. On the other, to imply that he was shortly afterwards one of the 70 elders upon whom the Spirit came. This, however, is not likely. Hobab does indeed seem to have gone with the people, but his descendants were not incorporated into Israel. They were with them, but not of them. Verse 32. If thou go with us. From Judges chapter 1 verse 16, we learn that the sons of Hobab joined themselves to the sons of Judah, and dwelt amongst them on the southern border of the land. Here is an undesigned coincidence, albeit a slight one. Judah led the way on the march from Sinai to Canaan, and Hobab's duties as guide and scout would bring him more into contact with that tribe than with any other. The actual departure from Sinai, verses 33 through 36, verse 33, and they departed. These words mark the moment of actual departure, which has been anticipated in the general statement of verse 12. It was one of the supreme moments in the life of Israel, one of those beginnings, or departures which lead to untold gain or loss. It was, in fact, although they knew it not, the commencement of a march which for almost all of them should know no end except within a hasty grave. No doubt, during the months spent at Sinai, every preparation had been made for the onward journey. But nonetheless it was a stupendous enterprise to march that vast host, so largely composed of women and children, so little inured to such fatigue, and so impatient of such discipline, for 3 consecutive days into a wilderness. 3 days' journey. This expression is apparently a general one, and not to be strictly pressed. Compare Genesis, chapter 30 verse 36, Exodus, chapter 3 verse 18, Exodus, chapter 15 verse 22. At the same time it implies, 1. That the host twice halted for the night during the journey, and 2. That the whole journey was regarded as one, and in some sense as complete in itself. The terminus ad quem of this 3 days' journey is given us in verse 12. It was to take them across the intervening belt of sand, and to land them fairly within the wilderness of Paran. During this journey, no doubt the march would be pushed on as steadily as possible, but it is not likely that it would cover so much as 30 miles. A modern army, unencumbered with non-combatants, does not make more than 10 miles a day over difficult country. Nor can cattle be driven faster than that. Even to accomplish that rate, and to keep the whole multitude together, as the narrative implies, required supernatural aid and strength. For the direction of the march, see notes on chapter 13. The Ark of the Covenant of the Lord went before them. It is obvious that what is apparently affirmed here is apparently at variance with Numbers chapter 2 verse 17 and verse 20. 1 of this chapter, which speak of the holy things, of which the ark was the most holy, as carried by the Kohathites in the very midst of the long line of march. 3 opinions have been held on the subject. 1. That the ark was really carried with the other holy things, and only went before metaphorically, as a general may be said to lead his troops, although he may not be actually in front of them, to which it is obvious to reply that if the ark did not actually precede the host, there was no possible way in which it could direct their movements. The cloud alone would be the visible expression of the divine guidance. 2. That the holy things generally were ordered to be carried in the midst of the host by the Kohathites, but that God reserved the place of the ark itself to his own immediate disposition. A general does not include himself in his own marching orders, however minute, and the ark was the outward symbol of God's own personal presence and guidance. It is therefore not at all surprising that the first intimation of the position of the ark on the march should be given at the moment when the march actually commenced. 3. That the usual place for the ark was no doubt with the sanctuary, as implied in the orders. But that this special occasion the ark went to the front in consequence of some divine intimation, just as it did at the crossing of Jordan and at the taking of Jericho. Certainly, there is much reason in this view, considering how momentous and formidable was their first essay at marching from their temporary home towards that unknown land beyond the northern horizon. If the deep waters of Jordan might fright them, or the walls of Jericho defy them, well, might they shrink from plunging into the broken, stony, and intractable country into which the ark and the cloud now led them. We shall probably think that either habitually, or at least occasionally, the ark did go before, and that the feet of them that bear it were supernaturally directed, either by the movements of the cloud, or by some more secret intimation, towards the destined place of rest. It is allowed by all that the cloud preceded and directed the march, and it would be strange indeed if these twin symbols of the divine presence had been so far separated from one another, for the accustomed place of the cloud was above the tabernacle, i.e., above the ark, yet outside of the tabernacle, so as to be visible to all. Verse 34. The cloud of the Lord was upon them by day. It would seem as if the cloud, which was luminous by night, dense, and dark by day, spread itself upwards and backwards from over the ark, overshadowing the host as it followed. A refreshment at any rate to those who were near, perhaps to all, and a guiding beacon to those who were afar. To what extent the people at large were able to enjoy this shade amidst the burning heats of the desert we cannot possibly tell. But there is no doubt that it dwelt in the memory of the nation, and gave meaning to such expressions as the shadow of the Almighty, Psalm chapter 91 verse 1, and the shadow of a cloud, Isaiah chapter 20, 5 verses 4 and 5. Verse 35. When the ark set forward, these words, taken in connection with the words when it rested, in the following verse, confirm the belief that at this time, at any rate, the ark went before the host, for if it had remained in the midst, it would not have stirred until half the tribes had moved off, nor would it have halted until half the camp was pitched, whereas it is evident that its setting forward and standing still were the decisive moments of the day. They had, as it were, a sacramental character. They were visible signs, corresponding to invisible realities, as the movements of the hands on the dial correspond to the action of the machinery within. When the ark and the cloud set forward, it was the Almighty God going on before to victory. When the ark and the cloud rested, it was the all-merciful God returning to protect and cherish his own. This is clearly recognized in the morning and evening prayer of Moses. The typical and spiritual character of that setting forward, and that resting could not well have been lost upon any religious mind. That God going before us is the certain and abiding pledge of final victory, that God returning to us is the only hope of present safety. Rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered. The 68th Psalm, which we have learnt to associate with the wonders of Pentecost and the triumphs of the Church on earth, seems to be an expansion of Moses' morning prayer. Verse 36. Return, O Lord, unto the many thousands, literally, myriad thousands, see Numbers chapter 1 verse 16 of Israel. They being construed with the accusative is of somewhat doubtful interpretation. It may be as in the beautiful and familiar rendering of the Authorized Version, than which nothing could be more obviously in harmony with the circumstances and the feelings which gave rise to the prayer. Or it may be necessary to translate it by a transitive verb, and then it will be either, with many moderns, restore, O Lord, the myriad thousands of Israel, i.e., to their promised home, or, with the Septuagint, convert, O Lord, the 1,000 myriads of Israel. If the ordinary reading be, as it appears grammatically defensible, it is unquestionably to be preferred. Only Moses, as he looked upon that huge multitude covering the earth far and wide, could rightly feel how unutterably awful their position would be if on any day the cloud were to rise and melt into the evening sky instead of poising itself above the sanctuary of Israel. The Septuagint transposes verse 34 from its proper place to the end of the chapter, apparently in order to keep together the verses which speak of the movements of the ark. Many Hebrew manuscripts mark verses 35, 36 with inverted nuns, but the explanations given are fanciful, and the meaning uncertain.